You will not believe this. The Federal Reserve themselves are now openly discussing the possibility of revaluing gold, something that for decades has been treated as a fringe idea whispered about by gold bugs and hard money advocates. But on August 1st of this year, straight from the Federal Reserve's own website, a research paper appeared titled, "The Official Reserve Revaluations, the International Experience." It might sound like just another dry economics note, but the timing of this paper is raising eyebrows everywhere. Because the United States is staring down a fiscal crisis of historic proportions. Debt to GDP has surged past 120%, national debt is spiraling higher every single day, and government spending is accelerating instead of slowing down. In fact, federal spending this year is already 7% higher than it was just last year. Deficits are blowing out again, and the interest costs on that mountain of debt are consuming a record share of the budget. Against this backdrop, the sudden talk of gold revaluation is sending shockwaves through financial circles. Think about the implications. Policymakers in Washington are desperate to keep spending money, but they're running out of options that won't spark immediate backlash. Raising taxes is politically suicidal. Borrowing more only accelerates the debt spiral. Printing directly through deficit monetization carries the risk of runaway inflation. So here comes this paper, floating the idea of using gold revaluation as a budget-neutral way to conjure up hundreds of billions, if not trillions, of dollars without formally raising taxes or issuing new debt. The very first line of the Fed's paper makes the intention clear. With public debt at high levels, some governments have begun to explore financing additional expenditures without raising taxes while also not increasing public debt outstanding. Read that again. They are explicitly talking about finding accounting tricks to finance new spending in ways that avoid calling it debt or taxation. For ordinary people, this kind of conversation sounds insane. If you're a family, a small business, or even a corporation, you know the rules. You can only spend money that you earn. If you borrow, you have to pay it back. If you don't, creditors come for you. But the federal government plays a different game. It can tax by law, borrow at will, or print currency outright. And now, they're examining ways to magically create fiscal space by simply changing the declared value of the gold they already own. Here's the basic math. The United States Treasury holds about 261.5 million troy ounces of gold, the largest official stockpile in the world. But by law, this gold is carried on the books at a statutory price of just $42.22 per ounce. That means the entire U.S. gold stockpile is officially valued at only around $11 billion. Compare that to the current market price of gold, which is trading above $3,300 per ounce. At true market value, those holdings would be worth nearly $861 billion. In other words, by keeping the official price frozen at 1970s levels, the government is effectively underreporting almost $1 trillion worth of potential assets. So the obvious question is, why not revalue it? Why not simply market to market, book the gains, and suddenly show hundreds of billions of new resources without lifting a finger? For you or me, that logic makes sense only if we can actually sell the gold or borrow against it. But for the government, selling the gold is not the point. In fact, if they sold the gold, the transaction itself wouldn't even be inflationary. Just like when you sell a car to a neighbor, money flows from one person to another, but no new money is created. If the U.S. Treasury dumped some of its gold onto the open market, it would receive existing dollars in exchange and could then pay down some debt or fund spending. That wouldn't necessarily add new money to the system. But that's not what policymakers want. They're not planning to liquidate Fort Knox. They're talking about pure revaluation, replacing the accounting line that says gold is worth $42 with a new line that says gold is worth $3,300. The gap between the two numbers would then be recognized as a gain, and depending on the mechanism chosen, that gain could be transferred directly to the Treasury's general fund. In practice, that means new money creation under the guise of budget-neutral financing. The Fed paper outlines 3 methods that countries have used to do this. The first method is simple: revalue the gold on the central bank's balance sheet and then transfer the difference to the government as profit. The second method uses a special revaluation account at the central bank, which again sends the gain to the government. The third method keeps the revaluation within the central bank itself, using the higher gold valuation to offset losses on its balance sheet without directly handing cash to the government. For the United States, with its reserve currency privilege and its fiscal desperation, only the first two methods would matter. Both of those effectively mean printing money against a higher notional value of gold and wiring the proceeds to the Treasury. This isn't some far-out fantasy. Congress has already seen proposals to do exactly this. A bill called the Bitcoin Act of 2025 was introduced earlier this year, and while it is focused on building a strategic Bitcoin reserve, tucked into its provisions is a mechanism that would force the Federal Reserve to swap its outdated gold certificates, currently priced at $42 an ounce, for new ones valued at fair market price. The idea is that the Fed would tender its old certificates, receive new ones priced at today's gold level, and then remit the difference in cash to the Treasury. Depending on the gold price used, this could hand the government roughly $1 trillion overnight. That's why the term budget neutral keeps popping up in these discussions. It's not neutral in the real economy, it's printing money. But on paper, it allows Washington to say they haven't raised taxes or borrowed more. And this is not without precedent. The US government has done this before. During the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt confiscated gold from American citizens under the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. People were forced to turn in their gold to the government at $20.67 per ounce. Once the Treasury controlled nearly all the gold, Roosevelt promptly raised the official price to $35 per ounce. That single revaluation instantly gave the government enormous new spending capacity because it raised the legal value of its holdings without any additional mining or trade. In effect, it printed money under the cover of a legal reprice of gold. Later, in 1971, Richard Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold, ending redeemability altogether. But the legacy of official pricing remained, with gold still carried at the statutory $42.22 per ounce today. The Fed's new paper is reminding everyone that those numbers can be changed by law at any time, and that doing so can unleash a flood of new liquidity. Of course, the dangers are obvious. Calling it budget neutral doesn't make it inflation neutral. Anytime new money is created and transferred to the government to spend, it increases demand in the economy without an increase in supply. That's the textbook recipe for inflation. And in today's fragile environment, with prices for food, energy, and housing already under pressure, a $1 trillion injection via gold revaluation would almost certainly stoke higher prices. It would give temporary breathing room to Washington, but ordinary Americans would feel the consequences at the grocery store, the gas pump, and in their mortgages. It's also worth noting that this isn't only a U.S. conversation. Other nations have experimented with similar revaluations. Italy and Germany in the past booked valuation gains on their gold reserves and used them to offset budgetary pressures. Lebanon, South Africa, and even Belgium have done versions of this. The idea keeps resurfacing whenever governments face crushing debt loads and limited fiscal options. It's essentially a form of accounting alchemy, taking an asset that already exists, changing the number on the ledger, and declaring that the difference is new usable money. Skeptics argue this is nothing but a gimmick. Supporters say it's simply recognizing reality. After all, if the gold is worth more, why not mark it properly and use the gain? But the truth is more complicated. The US government cannot simply mark the gold higher and call it a day. Once that revaluation is monetized, it's indistinguishable from printing. And unlike in 1934, when the US was still the world's creditor, today the US is the world's biggest debtor. Debt is already over $37 trillion. Deficits are running above $1 trillion per year, and interest payments are expected to cross $1.2 trillion annually. In that environment, a one-time $1 trillion boost from gold revaluation won't fix the system. It won't even slow the bleeding. It will just add fuel to the spending fire. There's also the question of politics. Would Congress actually pass such a measure? Would the executive branch embrace it? Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has already made comments suggesting reluctance to pursue radical strategies like outright buying Bitcoin, even though Congress is floating it. But the language of budget-neutral pathways to new reserves keeps surfacing. And when policymakers start recycling phrases across different contexts, first in a Fed research paper, then in a congressional bill, then in Treasury statements, you know the idea is being seriously discussed behind closed doors. What's clear is that gold revaluation is no longer just a conspiracy theory or a talking point for hard money advocates. It's back in the mainstream conversation, openly examined by the Federal Reserve itself. And history shows that when governments get desperate, they will reach for any tool that allows them to keep spending. Confiscation, devaluation, revaluation. None of these are off the table when debt crises loom. For ordinary Americans, that means one thing: prepare for turbulence. Because whether the trigger is gold, Bitcoin, or some new accounting scheme, the outcome is the same: more money creation, more inflationary pressure, and more erosion of the dollar's purchasing power. And that brings us to the key question. If the government does go down this path, what will the money actually be used for? Paying down debt? Highly unlikely. Running a surplus? Forget about it. Every historical example shows that new fiscal space is immediately consumed by new spending. The political incentives guarantee it. Trillion-dollar wars, trillion-dollar stimulus programs, trillion-dollar entitlements. The machine always finds a way to absorb more cash. So, a gold revaluation windfall would not restore discipline. It would almost certainly accelerate the very problems it was meant to address. For Americans already struggling with high grocery bills, rising rents, and record credit card balances, that is a sobering thought. A technical accounting maneuver in Washington could ripple out into everyday life in ways most people won't see coming. Higher prices, a weaker dollar, shaken confidence in U.S. financial stewardship. These are not distant possibilities. They are the natural consequences of financial engineering on this scale. So, here we are. The Federal Reserve has put gold revaluation back on the table. Congress is openly debating radical new reserve strategies, and the Treasury is leaving the door cracked open. History tells us that when the pressure builds enough, the extraordinary becomes the inevitable. The only question now is when. If you've made it this far, you understand why this moment is so important. The decisions being made in Washington right now will shape not just the future of the dollar, but the financial reality of every household in America. And that's why it's critical to stay informed, to see through the accounting tricks, and to prepare for what comes next. Because when governments start revaluing gold, shifting reserves, and conjuring money out of thin air, it's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of desperation. And desperate governments rarely make choices that benefit ordinary citizens in the long run. Thank you for watching. If you found this breakdown helpful and eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with friends and family who need to understand what's happening behind the headlines. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into the economic shifts reshaping our world. The storm is coming, and it's better to face it prepared than blindsided.